This video is going to be about some tools and the details of some of the parts I'm using to get this amplifier under construction. One of the first things you'll need is a good soldering iron. I used this little Velman, which wasn't a real expensive device. I like it because it's got an adjustable heat range here. It can solder fairly heavy stuff if needed, but it's also got a fine tip and seems to be a really good size for doing point-to-point wiring, as well as some of the larger circuit boards. There's other options available, some of the straight plug-in pencil types. I don't think it's super critical in this application the type of soldering iron you use, but you want something with a fine tip like this. Okay, one of the next tools that's very useful in building an amplifier like this and laying it out is just some plain vernier calipers. I know you could probably get some of the dial type too. I like just the plain kind. I've had this for probably 30 years, and it's been these central tools are really nicely made. So you could get by with even plastic ones if you want to save some money, but you need some way of accurately measuring and laying out where you're going to be drilling the holes. Because these have pretty sharp tips here and here, you can use these for like going on the edge and then marking where the hole's going to be. So I highly recommend you get some sort of calipers like this for laying out the tube sockets and everything else on your chassis. The next thing that you're going to need is some sort of a drill. I have just this handheld Makita drill. I mean, a lot of people you see are saying that you need a drill press or some other really fancy thing. Any kind of hand drill, even a cord one, will work fine for doing this kind of work. This isn't super precision stuff. Next, you'll need a set of good drill bits. I have this set of Irwin bits that I've had for a long time. It comes in, as you can see, it's all different sizes. They're nice and sharp. They cut good. They're also stepped so that even the larger sizes will fit in a 3/8 chuck, which is nice to have. And the larger sizes are useful for when you have to do some bigger holes for the punches and stuff like that. So you'll need a good set of drill bits. Another tool that you're going to need is some sort of a multimeter. I've got this Fluke. Was this a 17B plus? They make a bunch of different ones. I got this one because it will handle up to 1,000 volts for some of the higher voltage projects I've worked on. But for this one, you don't need anything, even this fancy. Here's another one I have it's a cheap it's a Velman product. It goes up to 600 volts, and it would work perfectly fine for building this amplifier. Another tool that's nice to have is some round files. I have a couple of different sizes of these. They make them in straight sides like this. They make them with tapers. You can pick these up at like Home Depot or somewhere like that. Sometimes they'll be with the chainsaw stuff, but having some round files, a couple of smaller ones, and then a bigger one like this for making sure that the tubes, if you need to enlarge things like the tube socket holes, these are very useful. As far as doing the tube socket holes, these are just the greatest. They're chassis punches. This is I think this is a Greenlee one. I also recommend getting the ones with the ball bearing washer at the top. It makes them a lot easier to turn as you're pulling this anvil through the die to punch the hole. These punch perfect holes. This is think an 18 point, let me look real quick. Yeah, this is an 18.6 millimeter that fits these tube sockets exactly. I believe a 3/4 inch is real close as well. You can do this using like one of those cone-shaped step drills and stop when you get close and then finish it off with like a round file to get it to the exact size. I would not use a hole saw. They jerk and grab and you're going to make a mess of your chassis trying to use a hole saw. So either you can buy these used on eBay, that's where I got mine, or obviously you can purchase them new, but this is something that'll pretty much last a lifetime in the amount that we're doing. And if you foresee that you may be building more amps in the future, you can usually find these for less than $50 on eBay, and I think they're worth the investment. Okay. One other tool that's very handy to have is a set of carbide burrs and a Dremel tool. These allow you to open up holes that are irregularly shaped, like the power outlet hole where you put the power inlet hole where you're going to put that. The square hole for that is really hard to make without something like this to, fine tune the hole. Another thing that's handy to have for doing those kind of irregular shaped holes is some sort of a jigsaw. Something like this is fairly cheap at a store. This is just a Stanley jigsaw, and they've got different blades. This one's a little coarse for doing metal work, but it actually worked when I used it. So I don't think it's real critical for the work we're doing, because you're just going to be roughing in holes, and then you'll be finishing them off with either the Dremel tool or this round file. Next, I wanted to talk about a couple of other little things that are handy to have. I bought this little kit of rubber grommets off Amazon, and it's got 6 millimeter, 8 millimeter, up to like 12 millimeter grommets that you can put in these will go where the hole where the wires go through, so that you don't end up rubbing the insulation off and causing a short. Plus, they just make things look nicer. I use these when I run the wires for the transformer through the chassis. And one of these little grommet kits is fairly cheap, and again, it'll last through a bunch of amplifier builds. Another thing is a little heat shrink tubing assortment that I got off Amazon. Again, it was fairly cheap, and it gives me some pre-cut heat shrink tubing that allows me to shrink up bare wires and stuff inside the amplifier, then help neaten some things up. Highly useful little kit. The last thing that's kind of a building material for the kit is some PTFE sheathing that you can put over bare wires like resistor leads. It's just a way of neatening up the look inside the amplifier. And of course, you're going to need some wire. And I would recommend getting a little kit that has multiple different colors. Again, got this off Amazon. It comes with a bunch of different color wires with neat little spools, and it helps you kind of keep track. Having different color wires helps you keep track of things. I've actually been using either 18 or 20 gauge solid core wire for my point-to-point builds. I think it helps the neatness inside the amp being solid core, and you can bend them as you need. The 18 gauge is probably overkill for the signal path, but there's not that many wires inside the amplifier where you need to be concerned about running out of space. And the 18 gauge wire can be twisted together to make the heater wiring, where 20 gauge might be a little on the light side. So if you're going to just get one box of wire, get 18 gauge solid core copper to build this amplifier. The next thing I want to go look at is the RCA jacks. There's two different kinds. These are the cheaper ones, and you see these pretty commonly around, and they come in these pieces, and you need insulated ones. So on this style, you're soldering the plus to here. The ground goes to this little tab here, and then these insulators has a little step on it to insulate the body of the RCA jack from the chassis, because you do not want to ground these to the chassis. That'll create a ground loop and make the amplifier hum. So these are one option. These slightly more expensive ones, and they come in gold, copper, and this rhodium color. The reason I like these is you solder the ground to the body and you solder the plus to this, and there's no separate tab that then requires the ground to go through this kind of clamped connection of these two, that it's directly soldered. So I know I'm getting a good connection with these. Plus, they just look a lot nicer. The little nut's a lot better looking than that nut, and they're not super expensive. I get these off eBay. On the speaker binding post that I use, here are the little cheap ones that you see everywhere. And again, they have a little, they got a little tiny nut, and it clamps this tab with a little lock washer onto the body of the binding post. And here's your little insulators. And two problems with this is, again, you're requiring on this mechanical connection to make the electrical connection between the inside of the amplifier and the binding post. And if this nut ever works loose a little bit, you can end up with a loose connection, or you could end up with getting some corrosion, over time between this piece and this, and getting a bad connection. The other thing I don't like is I like using pretty fat 12 gauge speaker wire, and when you put a big fat wire in here, by the time you put the wire in there and you start turning this down, you get maybe a half a turn of thread engagement before it bottoms out on the wire. And so I feel like that over time it would be pretty easy to strip off a couple of these threads, and then you can't tighten down on the speaker wire. So I've been using these oversized ones, again, that I found on eBay. As you can see, they've got much better thread engagement with the actual nut that clamps down, and it's a two-piece nut. So once this part tightens down, it slips between the two instead of like scrubbing against the wire and breaking off the strands. The other thing that I like is there's no little extra tab. You're soldering the wire directly onto the post itself. And so you don't have to worry about there ever being any corrosion between the wire and the post, because it's directly soldered onto it. So these are what I would recommend using, but they are a little more expensive and they might be a little harder to find. So these other ones will work just fine, but I think for a higher quality product would be getting some of these. Next, these are the kind of tube jacks you need to get. They're the underside mount where you won't see the holder once you install them on the chassis, which I think looks better. And one of the little things I've got in the habit of doing, and I'll link where I buy these in the description, are these little tube rings. And what I like about these is The underside of these is threaded, and then you run the bolts up from underneath, and these sit on top of the chassis like this to hold the tube socket in place, and it gives a little decorative ring around where the tube goes, which I think looks really nice. They make them in 3 different colors. They got silver, gold, and black. So depending on the color of your chassis, you can match those or contrast and match the volume knob to this, and it just gives a neater look to the amplifier. Obviously, those are not necessary to build the amplifier, but I do think they dress them up and make them look nice. So the next thing we're going to look at is the power transformer, which is, we're using a Hammond 269EX. It's actually had a hard time finding a voltage low enough for this amplifier. Most tube amplifiers are using, way over 300 volt B+, and this amplifier is using right around 250 volts on the B+, and to get there we're doing a full wave rectifier instead of a bridge, and we're using this 380 volt center tapped transformer to get there, and we come out right a little over 240 volts on the B+ simmed. Reality, it's probably going to be more around 250, 255. Usually these put out a little more voltage than they're rated at. So I think that's going to be a good choice. This little 154M choke, 2 Henry choke, rated 100 milliamp, should be all we need to supply the power, to filter the power for this amplifier. Output transformers. We have a couple of options here, depending on how much money you want to spend. Musical Power Supply has these on eBay, and I can't remember the price right offhand, but I think they're under $20. They have plenty of power. This is an 8-watt single-ended rated transformer. The only downside to these is they don't have an ultralinear tap. They do have a 5K and a 7K primary tap, and then they have a 4, 8, or 16 ohm secondary. It is an option, but in my opinion, not having the ultralinear tap is the real downside to these, because you can only then wire this amplifier as either a triode or as a pentode. With the pentode, you're going to have a much more complicated feedback circuit, and so it just makes the build more complicated using these, unless you think you'll be happy with just wiring this thing up as a triode amp, which will still sound nice. What I'm going to be building mine with is these 10-watt Edcors. They're little, you can see they're a little larger, they got a little fatter core. I believe they're probably higher quality than those than the other ones we just looked at. These are GXSE 10-5K. They come with this is the ultralinear tap, which really improves the sound and the power output of the amplifier. I think they look nice. They bolt down with these 4 screws instead of 2, so they sit down a lot nicer. We're going to be replacing these silver bolts with some black Allen bolts, which I think look a lot nicer. And a pair of these it's going to make for a really nice looking amplifier. So the last thing we're going to cover is how I determine the size of the chassis. And I usually wait until I get the iron, which is another name for the transformers, before I get started, so I can lay the things out in real time and really get an idea of how things are going to be, laid out on the chassis itself. So one of the things that's very important is you don't want to ever put the transformers in a line like that, with the laminations of the power transformer lined up with the laminations of the output transformers. it will introduce, through inductance, it'll introduce the hum from the power transformer into the output transformers, which is obviously not something that we want to happen. So the way you avoid that is you turn the power transformer 90 degrees to the output transformers. Now, you can do it like this, or you can turn both of these like this and then have the output transformer, the power transformer like that. My preference is mostly aesthetic, to put the two output transformers like this and then put the power transformer like this. So we have the transformers laid out with the way they're going to be on the chassis. The little choke is going to go somewhere up in here underneath the chassis on this case, because it's not an enclosed choke. And then the two tubes are going to sit somewhere like that in front of the output transformers. And so once we get, this is about as compact as you can have this layout. I like to keep a little gap between the output transformers. So then I get my tape measure, and a 9-inch chassis is going to be about as small as we can mount this on. And then if we go in this direction, the next size available and pre-made is 5-inch, which will give us plenty of room in the front here to mount the two tubes and to mount this and the point-to-point boards underneath where all the wiring will go. Plus, we'll be able to keep the signal away from the power side, which has been another one of my kind of design standards that I use. Is I put the power and all the AC on one end of the amplifier and keep the signal and the audio part on the other side. I see some amplifier builds where people put the power transformer between the two output transformers, but to me, that's just asking for hum to get generated into the amplifier, which is what we're trying to avoid. So I'm going to build this with the transformers laid out like this, and then I can put the speaker leads on this end, put the power jack here, put the power switch on this side in the front, and then the other thing that I've been doing is putting the RCA jacks on this side of my amplifier to keep the low voltage signal away from the output of the transformers and as far away from the AC power as I can. And then we'll put the volume knob up here in the front between the two tubes and run the RCA around like this, or run the input signal around like this. Now, you can do a mirror of this if you want. If it's easier for you to have the RCA signals coming in on this side, or you want to put the power on this side, you can just reverse all this stuff. But I'm going to build it this way, so that's the way we're going to do it. Anyway, I hope this is a good place for us to stop this video and let you start collecting some tools and some of the parts you need. These are going to take a long time for you to get. So order your power transformers now. If you want to build this thing, it's going to take 8 weeks at least for Edcor to get these transformers to you. I will link the transformer links in the description with the part numbers so you can start getting some of these parts ordered ahead of this video series, so that when you're ready to build this, you'll have all your parts.